Hi, everybody. I am very excited. And not just because we're in Florence, although that's not an insignificant part of this. I remember when I presented in Paris last year, the only people in the room were me and the presenters. So this is a treat. My name is Dr. Michael Medina. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. And it is my pleasure to be here to talk about some of the work that we do. My lab is called the Diversity and Development Lab, and we're interested in all things diversity related. Race, religion, gender, sexuality, anything that a young person could say set themselves apart. We study how it's important to their lives and their relationships. So today I'm going to talk about one of the programs that we evaluate. This program is called the Boston Debate League, and it's exactly what it sounds like. They study debate, um, argumentation, evidence-based public speaking, collaboration. And their premise is that these skills that seem specific to debate, are actually just great soft skills for young people to learn across content areas, genders, and classrooms. So this program is an evaluate, or this presentation is an evaluation of the work that they've been doing for the past 2 years across Boston public schools. If you're interested in reading the evaluation, the QR code is up there. If you're interested in learning more about the Boston Debate League, the QR code is up there. I'll present these again later in the talk in case I make you more interested in it later. But in short, I'm going to explain what the Boston Debate League would argue is a step forward in supporting marginalized young people in the United States, specifically Black and brown boys who traditionally have some of the lowest retention and success rates in public schools in the United States. To start, I want to read a quote from one of the students from one of our other studies, Abdul, who identified as Pakistani in seventh grade. And we asked Abdul, when we first started talking, you identified as Pakistani. Is this important to you or not such a big deal? Now, for context, this study was about identity generally and how these students' identities showed up in the classroom. And this particular student talked about their nationality. So Abdul spoke, well, it sort of saves me a spot. It's imagine like a pie chart and it's like cut into different pieces. The biggest part would be white people because that's the largest population in the United States now. And then there'd be a bunch of tiny little slivers. And I'd be one of those extremely tiny slivers because I'm probably the only Pashtun Pakistani in school. It just diversifies everything. It just adds more color and just kind of proves that the world isn't black and white. It's so many different things. It's a million pieces with a million pieces, which I should have named the talk that. This is just one of many different testimonies that we have from our students who unpromptedly talked about their nationality, race, and ethnicity as a major part of their background. This is unsurprising because young students in the United States are at the center of three realities in terms of their demographics. One is that the country is getting more racially diverse. Since the first time, since its founding, the majority of students in the United States do not identify as white. This is a shift, a demographic shift, the likes of which we've never seen in schools. And projections show within 40 to 60 years, the majority of individuals, not just students in the United States, will not identify as white. That is juxtaposed against the reality of who the teachers are in the United States. Roughly 80% of public school teachers in the United States identify as white. And they're the only demographic in which the teachers overrepresent the students in schools. Which is to say, if you do not identify as a white student, you are more likely than not to not have a teacher at some point in your public school education that represents your ethnic racial background. The third reality is something that is a little bit more commonly known, which is that the United States is an extremely racialized country, and the majority of students of color, before they get to college, report facing some form of ethnic racial discrimination from a peer, from a classmate. So that's in schools, in the protected, presumably protected setting of schools. So how do young people kind of navigate these three really distinct and unfortunately overlapping realities, and how do schools handle them? a common and prevailing premise in US public schools is a colorblind educational ideology, particularly with the current federal administration. This colorblindness, while on paper is prevailing, in reality is just not existent. It's not represented in US curriculum. It's certainly not represented in the diversity of student demographics. It's not represented in teacher training. Or, as Abdul testified, it's not represented within the minds of young people. And to juxtapose Abdul's quote with another, from this time from a Supreme Court justice, I'll read the entire quote. With "let them eat cake" obliviousness today, the majority pulls the report and announces color blindness for all by legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. This was in response to the shooting down of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in college administrations. So, in other words, while the law argues that colorblind education should be the law of the land, it's simply not so within classrooms, and the students know it. Some of the work that my team and I have done is to investigate what this means, what this juxtaposition between the reality and the law means for young people. And what we found is two areas of critical consequence. One is the development of students' ethnic racial identity, which is their sense of pride and positive regard about their cultural background. And the other is their sense of critical consciousness, which is the extent to which they feel aware of racial injustice in the United States and a motivation to do something about it. Students depend on positive mentors, particularly mentors who represent their own background, to develop safe spaces for them to explore these two things: where they come from and what it means to be an activist in support of where they come from. And when schools don't represent that, when their teachers don't support that, when institutions don't speak to multiculturalism, both of these things suffer. And unfortunately, in this model that my colleague and I developed, they're intertwined. To hurt one is to hurt the other. That is to say, when young people don't have the opportunity to develop a positive sense of self, they're less likely to be advocates for the marginalized, their groups and other groups. So what do we do about that? Introducing the Boston Debate League, one such institution that believes they have an evidence-based approach to support young students of color in the United States. This is a non-for-profit organization that started as an actual debate league, which is what made me interested in it. I grew up debating. I know that sounds really geeky, but it's fun, I promise you. But what the Boston Debate League did is they took these principles, public speaking, critical thinking, argumentation, evidence-based approaches, and incorporated them into public school curricula, content area agnostic, because they believed that these skills can support any student. And what they did is they made a program called the Resolve Program that was specifically for Black and brown boys. Again, the group most likely to drop out of school, lowest retention rates and lowest achievement rates in public schools. And they made a space just for them, only taught by Black and brown men, and only discussing culturally relevant issues for these communities, using curricula that focused on those debate-inspired skills. So these Black and brown boys were going to talk about the equity gap. They were going to talk about the reading gap. They were going to talk about the income gap among Black and brown individuals in the United States and white individuals in the United States, but they were going to use debate-related skills. They were going to argue using evidence. They were going to public speak. They were going to collaborate. They had three guiding questions around whether a program like this embedded within US education could succeed. So the three questions are: what are the constructive and collective actual skills that these young people could develop in such a culturally minded space? Can they develop soft skills in that space? What skills could be transferred to other classrooms? Right? Is this cultural talk, is this race talk relevant in a math classroom? Are the skills that they develop there translatable to a social studies classroom? And lastly, what are the practices that the facilitators and teachers could use that could develop a space safe enough to cultivate these skills. This was intentionally kind of anti-colonial practicing in schools. These students weren't developing a traditional grade. They were alone, right? Demographics mattered, and they talked about real world issues. It was a risk. So our observations were between 2023 and 2024 across 4 public schools, and in collaboration with about a dozen public school teachers, we observed 12 different classrooms, 24 of these sessions, 3 coaching sessions with teachers. What's not listed here are multiple interviews with teachers as well as interviews with facilitators and focus groups with students. We talked to everyone all the time about all of it. Try with a protocol that we developed using multiple established measures of ethnic racial identity and critical consciousness, but also things like school belongingness, self-efficacy, social efficacy, confidence with peers, things like that. And we used a positive youth development framework to see what are the consequences of this work for this group that is already marginalized and at risk. If you're not familiar with positive youth development framework, it's a dual-pronged approach in which students are considered more than just learners in the space. They are co-creators of the space. So student perspectives matter and were recorded during these resolve sessions with a real intentional gaze on what areas of their identity were being developed during these classroom sessions. How visible did they feel? How safe did they feel to communicate their thoughts and ideas about their cultural background in these spaces? Whereas teachers weren't just content administrators, although they did that, they were also there to intentionally practice supportive practices, collaborative communication, role building with these students, and developing a climate of activities in which culture was at the forefront, right? And the realities of the risks that these students face in the classroom were also at the forefront and publicly discussed. And PYD has these 5 kind of standard practices, where a successful PYD classroom is one in which these 5 C's feel present, visible, and highlighted for young people. That being said, we developed an impact chain model here. And all this is just to say that we actually took it seriously, right? We actually did some research. And we used a critical consciousness framework as well as a social identity and PYD framework to argue that there are multiple steps involved in what is traditionally just seen as a learning space, right? The facilitators are engaging in these debate-inspired practices very intentionally, right? During coaching sessions and curricular training, they are learning practices that are traditionally seen as debate practices. How do you get a student to stand up and argue against their friends? How do you get a student to collaborate when traditionally they don't want to be there, right? How do you get a student to admit when they don't know the answer, a counterpoint to an argument presented to them? These are hard. These are ego fractures for these kids, right? So the teachers were learning practices based in critical consciousness to encourage that kind of public admittance of knowledge and argumentation. At the same time, students would be rewarded and encouraged to engage through communication, both verbal and written, with ideas that traditionally were seen as non-content areas, right? Ideas related to their cultural background, ideas related to racial stigma, right? Ideas related to the racialization of the country, content that had been wholly and intentionally excised from their content areas in other classrooms, right? How do you encourage students to do that? When the debate-inspired practices and the encouraged students come together, the long-term goal is that they develop these soft, critical thinking skills that would, 1, get them to better understand their cultural background, 2, get them more critically motivated to do something about it, and 3, be able to transfer these skills to traditional learning areas, because at the end of the day, they're still students and they still need to graduate. Look at that, I summarized it right there. What we found over the course of a year of observations, these observations are still going on across a series of additional schools. We're developing a second report, but what we found in the first report were a series of 12 common practices that we saw in classrooms that we were able to develop across 4 different categories. Teacher practices that encourage critical consciousness and ethnic racial identity development. Classroom climate building practices that intentionally focused on student joy and retention. Exercises that were designed to be content agnostic. And then disciplinary practices that were less punitive and more inviting. If you want details of these, again, they're in the report, and I'll show the QR code in a second. But what I want to focus on is that because we looked across more than a dozen different content areas, both middle schools and high schools in multiple public schools, we could not find a consistent pattern of words that teachers say or activities that students do that develop this. It's just impossible, and that's what we anticipate, right? Rather, we were looking for themes, right? Patterns of behavioral recognition that invite students in and encourage teachers to focus on not just content, but also practice. And across these 12 themes, what we found is an underlying theme of consistency, which is to say, when these students were presented with curricular material that wasn't common to them, but was presented consistently and in an environment that was encouraging and welcoming, that was enough to increase their retention rates and their grades, most importantly, across other content areas. On average, the students in this particular program, again, classes just for Black and brown boys with Black and brown male teachers talking about cultural issues. On average, these students in their STEM classes over the course of the year increased their grade by a full letter, increased their retention rate by over 20%. And these classrooms, these resolve sessions, doubled in size the following year, not through advertising. This is a non-for-profit organization, through word of mouth from the students. Some more details that we found. Consistent and transparent practices, culturally focused practices, help to fast track racial identity development among these young kids, which is to say, when the class started, almost every student struggled to identify and articulate their racial identity. By the end of the class, not so. And perhaps more importantly, we're able to connect the importance of that identity to school and why it mattered to them in school. Students became more communicative and collaborative and were more effective, not just within resolved spaces, which was a concern for the Boston Debate League and frankly for my evaluation team, but they're more effective in communicating these practices in other classrooms. Classrooms that were not exclusively Black and brown, classrooms that were taught by white women, classes that were STEM focused. Another really highlightable area of the Resolve program is that students were told this is what is happening in this classroom. They were explicitly highlighted that this classroom is meant to develop your identity and critical consciousness. We are here to talk about those things that you're not allowed to or expected to talk about in other classes. It was very explicit. And the rule building was explicitly collaborative. And as such, we saw benefits outside of this classroom because those students became more comfortable discussing these topics in areas that were not facilitated by these common facilitators. So why does this matter within the US? Well, some of you may know Donald Trump is our president, and he's not a big fan of the US educational system. A little understatement to end our talk. He has very actively, openly, and proudly worked to dismantle the education department within the United States. An education department that at the time of his admittance into office was very explicit around its efforts to support Black and brown students. Not so anymore. In fact, quite the contrary. Pushback, as we heard in one of our earlier talks. Trump's changes to the educational system are generational. the funding that he has pulled, the efforts that he has made, and the laws that he has pushed to dismantle and intentionally target programs that support students like those in Resolve will last far beyond these initial studies. And unfortunately, the courts can't save us. Right? We've seen that time and again. While they're doing their best, real change for young kids like Abdul happen in the classroom by facilitators and peers willing to discuss the realities of our damaged educational system. Thankfully, the Boston Debate League and programs like it have been quite vocal in discussing things like transparency of education, like the urgency of the need to support these young people, and like the need to be explicit about having an anti-racist approach, not a colorblind approach, but approach that intentionally battles federal policies designed to harm them. In terms of supporting critical consciousness and identity development, this project, which is still in focus and still going on, thankfully, did have a few takeaways I'd like you to focus on. One is that students are aware of what's going on in terms of their marginalization in schools and in terms of the importance of their identity to themselves and potentially not to others. We don't have to hide it. They know what's going on, right? And critical consciousness, this drive to make change, can be content agnostic if the practices being developed by teachers are simply welcoming and consistent in terms of encouraging students to delve into this topic of advocacy and equity. And that creating spaces that are supportive for students and teachers must be collaborative. Because while we understand perhaps the curricular side of the work being done, they understand the lived reality of existing as a student within both a diverse and a racialized space. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to talk more about this project in the future.